Welcome to T.S.O.B with Dr. G, a podcast featuring intellectual table talk about race and sexuality. I'm your host, Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert, a sexuality educator, writer, and researcher. Join me as I talk with the most brilliant minds in human sexuality, applying a professional Black lens to discussions about sexiness, health, and healing in the new millennium. It's T.S.O.B, the sex ed of Black folk. Let's get to the get down, shall we? All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of T.S.O.B with Dr. G. I am Dr. Tracy Gilbert, and y'all know I'm always excited, but this is hands down the most anticipated interview that I expected to have this season. And so I am ready to get in it. We are not going to waste any more time. But I also want to read Louie's bio real quick so y'all are clear about why he needs to be on this show. Louie Ortiz-Fonseca is an Afro-Boricua, queer, HIV-positive creative, born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is the creator of Gran Varones, a digital project focused on history, culture, and storytelling through a Black Latinx lens. He also works in partnership with young people living with HIV to combat stigma and hosts a YouTube series for LGBTQ youth called Kiki's with Louie. Louie is the father of an 18-year-old son and worships the patron saint Mariah Carey, as we all should. And I would like the record to reflect that I spent at least 15 minutes just meditating off of One More Again to get ready for this conversation, just because that's the mood I was in and I wanted to get in to be present here today. So without further ado, Louie, thank you so much for being here with me on T.S.O.B.
You done with T.S.O.B? Yeah, you know me.
Yes.
You done with T.S.O.B? Yeah, you know.
Listen. So let's go ahead and get started. Louie, the question that I ask pretty much all my guests is where you're from, where your people from, and what's got you thinking about sex and sexuality these days?
I am born and raised in North Philadelphia, and that is where my people from. My grandmother is Black Puerto Rican, so she came here in the 60s, and that's as far back as my family history goes. Like, I don't know anything before that. I don't even know anything, what is the word, like, beside her. Like, I know that she has sisters, but so, like, a lot of my history is framed around, like, growing up with my mother and my 6 brothers in North Philadelphia. So like if folks follow, Gran Varones or even my personal Instagram account, that's why a lot of my stories are around that time, especially in the 90s. And what has me thinking about sex and sexuality? Right now, I would say it is the lack of touch or just even being with people in community, talking about what we did, what we want to do, what we shouldn't have done, all of that stuff. So I miss talking about sex and pleasure with my friends.
Yes. That seems like such a common answer obviously a common answer that a lot of folks have is that with COVID, with the need to quarantine and to segregate ourselves, like it's really taken a toll on what would otherwise be our natural inclination to be up under each other and to, not only physically, but, verbally and in all ways, just be in each other's energy. So I definitely resonate with that. I want to ask you, you were very clear to specify that you are a Black Puerto Rican. Tell the people kind of how that distinction shows up for you and why. I'm assuming that it's important to make that distinction. Why you think it's important to make that distinction?
I think that the first, what the earliest memory that comes to mind around that is I remember going to, growing up, didn't think, we grew up in Black spaces and Black neighborhoods, and my mother always reminded us that, get your Black ass in the house, right? So it wasn't until I got older that I think you become conscious of like how people see things differently, right? So one of those is I remember being 13 and walking to the store And there was this black guy, these two drug dealers fighting on 9th in Indiana, and there was a black guy fighting a Puerto Rican guy. And these were drug dealers that my brothers hung out with that were all friends. But it was this fight that all the Puerto Ricans were saying, get him to the Puerto Rican, and all the black guys were saying, get him to the. And it was the first time it was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's something here. Like it that always stuck with me. Like, oh, when we're in a fight, there are distinctions, right?
Right.
And then when I
Right.
started to go hang out in gay clubs, because Philadelphia is a metropolitan city, but it is like America. It is very segregated.
Facts.
So I would, just be fagging out, and someone would come over to me and be like, somebody told me you're Puerto Rican. What kind of Puerto Rican are you? Are you black Puerto Rican or white Puerto Rican?
Mm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
externally, there were Puerto Rican gay guys who hung out with white gay guys, and then there were Puerto Rican guys who hung out with black gay guys.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Mm-hmm.
like those were like my earliest, because the way we talk about race and the way we talk about Latinx is very different than the way we talked about it in 1993, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to
Mm-hmm.
remind folks
Mm-hmm.
that even when Amara La Negra, there was conversation around her blackness. I mean, so much has happened that we forget that that was a moment on Twitter. So if
Mm-hmm.
that was only just
Mm-hmm.
a couple of years ago, you can only imagine what the conversation was like in 1993. But
Facts.
it was still
Facts.
present, right? Because
Facts. Yeah.
um, while there's ethnicity part, it was clear that people were asking, "Where are you?" And kind of like what you asked, "Where are your people from? How do you move through the
Mm-hmm.
world?" I would, become
Mm-hmm.
more familiar with that language later on. Um, but yeah, but there is a distinction. And I think in terms of when we talk about sex and sexuality, and when we talk about bodies, we have to be clear about those distinctions when we're talking around about Latinx folks, right? Because
Yeah.
the same way that the general quote unquote knowledge around sex ed and sexuality, it is through this Anglo lens, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is that shows up when we say, well, let's talk about sex among Puerto Ricans or other Latinos. It's still coming from that. Yeah, but everyone in this room moves to the world very differently, and the world
Very
pushes them
differently.
very differently. So I think that for the context of
Absolutely.
this conversation, that is why it's clear to make those distinctions.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, because it's funny. I also at this point we'll have aired the episode I did with Bianca Loriano, and so her entry into this discussion is very different as well. Even though she also identifies as Black, Latinx, and Puerto Rican, and as someone who I always say, I ain't never had the distinctions. Like nobody ever looked at me and was like, "Oh, you could be." It was always you're Negro, you're Black. It's always been interesting to me to interact and talk with other Latinx folks and kind of talk about what Blackness looks like for them, because there are these different dimensions that you're talking about, and yet when we face with these systems and we come across these systems, there's this truncating that happens where it's like, oh, y'all are either all here or you're all there. And so I think it's important to make those distinctions and tease out the different pieces. So thank you for starting us there. Let's get from there into sex though. How did you go from Louis, from I think you said ninth in Indiana? What
Yes.
was that? From North Philadelphia, becoming the amazing Louis that you are with Gran Varones, with Louis's mixtape, all of which we're gonna get into. How'd you get there?
I would say that folks who are not familiar with Knife in Indiana, like Nightline did a whole freaking documentary about our neighborhood in like the early 90s. That was hella problematic. That is how we got the name the Badlands. They did like a
Mm.
series on us. You can buy the video on Amazon, but we don't shop from there. But it's not on YouTube, unfortunately. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a neighborhood that, like a lot of many inner cities in the 90s, like plagued by crack, AIDS, violence, poverty. But even with all of that happening, there was always music, right? There was
Mm-hmm.
always just joy, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the struggle was ever present, but when the struggle is every day, it becomes like the sky, the blue, like it's blue. You don't you feel it, but you don't always notice that it's ongoing because it always is. So
Right.
within that,
Right.
you find what you can find to, give you some semblance of peace. And that was music. I stayed in the house all the time. My mother struggled with crack addiction for many, many years. And, I don't have a coming out story. Like, I think, my mother, like, she was like, child, I know it's good. But because of that, I got to keep
Right.
your ass in the house because I can't keep going outside fighting every time somebody calls you a name, right? So
Right.
because I stayed in the
Right.
house, I consumed so much entertainment,
Mm-hmm.
right? That is why I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you what was on Wednesday nights on ABC in 1992, right?
Facts.
Um,
Facts. Yes.
so I think because of that, like that is how I connected to the world. That is how I made sense of the world, how I made sense about my identity, how I made sense about, what I loved and what I didn't love, what I thought what love was going to be, or what I thought
Mm-hmm.
what love or sex, what I hoped it would be. All of that is through the lens of music. And that is what has guided me on my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
so like it was because of music. I was a seventh grade high school dropout, always wanted to go to the club to dance. So funny, my mother didn't allow me to go outside, but I was allowed to go to Woody's every Wednesday night to dance my
Now
ass
that is
off.
funny.
And because of that, again, my love for music, I met someone who got me the opportunity to get into HIV prevention.
Mm.
Right. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was because of my wanting to dance and meeting somebody else who loved to dance and was like, hey, I think I may have this opportunity for you. I don't know. Call tomorrow. We'll see how it happens. And that is how, and because of that, as a seventh grade dropout, that one experience led me to the opportunities of continuing my re-engage and continue with my education,
Wow.
but also doing this
Mm-hmm.
work. So like music literally
Was the
says
path.
yes.
Was the bridge. Wow. Wow. I love that. I love that. Yeah. It's so funny because y'all both have parts of your story that I was like, yeah, that was me. Like, for me, it was about being a latchkey kid and the idea of like the streets were unsafe, so you have to be in the house. So, like what you said, Louie, like I picked up everything from TV, from movies. Like my whole life was based on trying to be one of the Huxtables, trying to be on a different world, uh, auditioning to become a new member of In Vogue. Like that was my whole trajectory. And for me, it wasn't the tape player because I didn't get my first tape player until I was like a freshman in high school, but it was a record player in my attic where my bedroom was, and it was one of those kind of old Fisher Price ones, but my mother's albums were up there, so I was up there like the first time I got introduced to Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life. I was up in the attic playing her albums and put on Pastime Paradise, and then looked at my record player like, because that was right around the time that Gangsta's Paradise had come out, and I'm thinking, oh, that's original. And then I look, and then I'm listening like, oh snap, right? This whole new world, and so I wanted to have this particular episode one because it's gonna air the first week of June, which is Black Music Month, but also because I think there's not enough, in my mind, conversation about the ways that Black music in particular helps inform the way we think about sex and even how it shows up in sex ed, right? I think often about the popular, like how predominantly white, but even some Black folks, like when we want to do with young people, they pull on Salt and Pepper, which at this point is like, this song is 30 years old. People, let's talk about sex. But I'm also just reminded of like sex lives and breathes in our culture in very not just important ways, but very life affirming ways that I don't think get recognized as much as they should. Like I wouldn't know what it means to make love if it weren't for Boys to Men, if it weren't for Luther Vandross, if it weren't for the Whispers and like these older groups, the Isley Brothers. We just experienced the verses with the Isley Brothers and Earth, Wind and Fire. Like having those conversations, like I wouldn't know that, oh, pleasure is something that's even accessible if it weren't for those songs. And so I like, that's something that's coming up for me, even though, you know, we live kind of in this environment where the assumption is that, oh, everybody's afraid of sex. And it's like, not in these songs. We not like in the song. It's very grown folk. It's giving very, we out here, we doing our thing and we enjoy it ourselves. Louis, did you have some thoughts about that?
I think the first, I'm gonna just say Janet Jackson's Someday Is Tonight was kind of like my
Mm-hmm.
entry into like what sex could be, right? But also from this very 80s perspective, right? Because it's a song about I'm ready, thank you for waiting, tonight I'm giving you a gift. And I remember hearing that like because it falls in line with, what's happening at that time, like, the AIDS epidemic is raging. We're getting messages around teen pregnancy. I don't know. Remember those messages like teen don't get like all of this was happening. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. So it's all these things that are happening
Absolutely.
in concert with the release of Rhythm, Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation, released on September
Mm-hmm.
16th, 1989.
Mm-hmm.
And Someday Is Tonight was kind of like it gave you I'm a virgin and tonight we're going to make love and it's going to be my gift to you. And I remember thinking that was so
Yeah.
sweet as a kid, right? Like I'm innocent, I'm not
Right.
doing anything wrong, but if I'm going to have sex, it's going to be like this is going to be a gift. I'm going to get my hair done, it's going to be pretty, not in order to make me feel
Mm-hmm.
good, but like what's going to make me feel good is what my how my partner is going to feel. And I think a lot of those 80s and
Mm.
90s songs are about that.
That's a good point.
And it's not neither
Yeah.
good or bad, right or wrong. That's just where we were. And I think that when we,
Mm-hmm.
tease out also what was happening in the culture, like it's like, does the music inform the culture or does the culture inform the music?
That's a good point. Yeah. And I think, yeah, well, I think the obvious answer is that
Hmm.
it's continually a back and forth, right? Because even when you look at Janet's trajectory, right? We started with Let's Wait a
Yep.
While, right? Even though on the same album we had Funny How Time Flies When You're Having Fun, which nobody likes to talk about, but I'm like, that's the real anytime, any
Yes, yes,
place in
yes,
terms of
yes,
the song
yes.
to get you in. But then we get to, like you said, Someday Is Tonight, and then we get to, we talked about this on Instagram the other day, the big reveal from the Love Will Never Do video, and then all of a sudden it's Janet,
Yes.
right? But it really kind of matches this trajectory of like, yeah, when you're young, when you're maybe quote unquote in a more innocent space, that's how you need to perform and
Mm,
that's how you need to portray. But after a while, like we get free, we recognize that we have the capacity to make healthy decisions, and not only to make healthy decisions, but to decide what we want in terms of pleasure and fulfillment and what have you, till when we get to discipline and now we're on stage and pulling people on, right? And so it's this trajectory, and recognizing like that is
hmm.
normal. That is a part of a human trajectory. You're not going to always be like, well, today I'm going to have my legs closed. And because that's not good and it's not healthy and all of these things, it's like, no, it's part of the spectrum.
I mean, like even at house parties, I know people don't have them anymore. Definitely not now.
Well, they said they're remaking the film, which I was like, please start
Don't
remaking
please.
things. But
I will protest. But like in the 90s, we would go to house parties and like Silk freaked me. Like I sang it because it's the
yes,
catchiest song. But when you're in a party, the context changes, right? So if you're slow dancing with someone,
yeah,
it is a conversation around sex that you're having without having to say anything. When you're grinding on
yep,
someone who's in the back of the wall to a reggae song or a hip hop song, you're having a conversation around bodies without you're letting the song
mm-hmm.
verbalize what is
Speak for
happening,
you.
but the body is moving. And I think that for
Mm-hmm.
me is a perfect example of how like how music is part of the conversation around sexuality and black bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you what you just said made me think of being like, even before I had a sexual debut, before I even recognized myself as a sexual being, it was like, oh, this song comes on, you automatically know this is what you do to that
Yes.
song. And so I think the song for me, there was many, but I know Adina Howard, Freak Like Me was one. Right? These songs, I know, but we talked about side chicks. SWV had a few. Where theirs were songs where it's like, oh, this is what you do to that song,
Any
right? Obviously, Two Live
yeah,
Crew
any
and
Luke song.
that whole any Luke song, right? Like you just they were almost instructive, if you will, in terms of how you were to engage with it. But yeah, because I'm not gonna, Jodeci, right? I was like, I'm not gonna hear a Boys to Men song when I want to like just grind on the wall. But like, yeah, fiending, absolutely. Freaking you, absolutely. Um, so thinking of all the amazing things you do, both with Gran Varones and with Louie's mixtape, what do you feel like your sex ed superpower is?
I think it's talking about history through music,
Mm-hmm.
right? I love that we have the Cardi B's, the Saweeties, Armante Butler, who's also Black Puerto Rican, who I work on Gran Varones with. Like
Yes, hey
that is
Armante.
his ministry, right? So all the new songs I know through Armante. That
Okay,
is how he supports
great.
the older girls. Like, listen to this because if we're at a party, I need you to know what we're dancing to. Um,
Right.
so while I appreciate that, I think it's important for us to talk about our history in a way that we honor it and not compare it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that happens a lot. Like, well, female women rappers weren't doing this in 1980. Well, let's talk about why they weren't. It's
Right.
like this was what was happening. This is what was going on. So I think my superpower is just bringing that to the surface so that we can so people can make those connections that we were always talking about, pleasure and sex, do the dire of situations, right? Like
Right.
even for Black queer folks, people were still making love and having relationships at the height of the AIDS epidemic, right? We don't hear
Yeah.
that a lot.
Yeah.
We hear like, oh my God, like we hear just all of the, the death. And while there was a lot, and we were definitely impacted, continued to be, relationships were still happening. Joy,
Right.
marriages were still happening. People were still getting it on. One night stands were still happening. Making wanting to
Mm-hmm.
feel good in my ass, in my mouth, in my eyes, in my shoulders. That was all still happening. And it is I hope that, my goal is reminding folks that those things were happening and but through the lens of music, because that's how I remember stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And what I feel, so I asked that for a reason because I was hoping you would say what I wanted you to say, and you absolutely did, because I agree that that's your superpower. And what I love about it, particularly as somebody whose lens is very much rooted in the history of Black folks in America. I love that you help folks see the length, because I think that's also part of our culture of like honoring your elders and honoring, like, we don't have to compare, but don't act like you're here out your, in a vacuum and you just came up with stuff by yourself. It's like there's a history, there is a legacy, and that is why you are able to fly today because of this. Like, for example, when WAP came out, the first thing I said was like, Spice ran so y'all could fly, right? Like,
Yes.
hoes with an attitude crawled so
Yeah.
y'all can walk. Like,
Yes.
don't act like y'all were the first ones ever to be like, this is what I want you to do with my pussy, right? Millie Jackson, and,
Exactly.
and being able to keep that, like, and I guess after I say this, I would love for you to talk about how you even started, why you decided to do your mixtape on IG. But I just love that because one, it helps me remember like I'm not as old as I feel when I don't see my own culture represented in the pop culture anymore. But also it just reminds folks like we have a history, we have a culture, we have a legacy, and it all absolutely matters. So please talk about Louie's mixtape, which has gone through a few iterations at this point, but it's all super amazing and I love
That's
it.
also because I keep losing those damn designs and have to recreate them. I make it better at that. So
Okay.
so in addition to like being in quarantine and my son being 18, like I'm coming to terms that he has his own life, right? I've always
Yes.
tried to give him bodily autonomy. It hasn't always been easy to stick by that. And by that, I mean, like, he sent me a photo of his new sleeve tattoo, that we didn't have a conversation about, but he went and got it. And while my instinct is to say, what? It is his body, right? And,
Right.
as soon as he got it, he took a picture and sent it to me. So I bring that up because I want to record my history.
Mm-hmm.
My history is connected to all of my friends who are no longer here, my mother who's no longer here, my brother who's no longer here. And I'm not going to wait
Mm-hmm.
for a book deal, right?
Right.
And I love talking about music. I love talking about songs. And because I remember them through moments of my life, I wanted to highlight them. And hopefully that, younger folks like my son who hear that sample, right? He was playing a song and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, that's Jodeci's Come and Talk to Me.
Please no.
And it was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, give me your phone. And I played it. And he was, oh my God, that is like, it never occurred to him. And because I still
Right.
feel young, I'm surprised when my son doesn't recognize a sample because that music is still new and fresh and vibrant to me. So I
Absolutely.
do, Louis' mixtape one to remind folks of the journey of Black and just popular music overall. Music that was
Mm-hmm.
called urban music in the 90s and 80s. But
Yes.
also, those are songs that soundtracked very important moments that are now being highlighted in documentaries, right? Those are songs that
Mm-hmm.
highlighted the crack epidemic, the AIDS
Mm-hmm.
epidemic, the Reagan years, the Bush years, right? And I think that while we get those documentaries around what terrorized us and what struggle was, it's like let's also talk about the music that our mothers listened to on Sundays, or music that we listened to in the attic or in the basement, right? Or
Yes.
when we were sitting
On
down,
the school
yeah, on a
bus,
school bus,
going to going to school.
or
Yes.
sitting on the step on a weekend, like or the songs that we kept the
Mm-hmm.
songbook of with lyrics. So that
Mm-hmm.
is my hope that, that is my contribution in that, get to revisit what I experienced as a teen around my identity, around, what I thought about sex and, my first crushes and my first kisses, that it also serves as a documentation for my son to read when I'm no longer here. And that it
Yeah.
inspires other people who may not identify as storytellers, like if you can remember where you were when you first heard Adina Howard's "Freak Like Me," that is a story,
Mm-hmm.
and I bet that
Yeah.
that story includes all of the things that was experienced by other people like you in your neighborhood. And it's only when I
Yeah.
frame it like
Yep.
that, when I do workshops around storytelling, do people get it, right? So I was like, tell you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
even if it's like, I remember first hearing a song, blah blah blah, that you're documenting a part of history that is not recorded in mainstream media or records. And those are the stories
Yeah.
that we need and that we're going to need 20 years from now.
Yeah. That's so powerful. That's so factual too. And I, for one, am appreciative because you remind me of stuff. I'm like, oh shit, I don't remember. I ain't listened to that. And like I think it was K7, Come Baby Come. I was like, I ain't heard this song in about 30
Let me
years.
tell you,
But when I tell you,
I,
I used to give my life to that
I
song.
went to a dance audition for a hip hop video in the 90s and I was so nervous. And I get up to the front and there were two black guys, I think two like producers, and they gave me the book of CDs. And like I'm going through it and I guess I was taking too long. And he said, why don't you dance to this one? And gave me K7. And I knew in the moment why he told me to dance to K7. And my dumbass said, yeah, I'll dance to Come Baby Come.
Oh, what a
Needless to
moment.
say, I didn't get the gig.
but but you've actually you toured as a dancer, right?
Yes. One day I would tell
Okay.
more about that story.
I was gonna say we don't have enough time to get into that, but I feel like that's a kiki with Louie that I want to be part of and learn more about. So I'm gonna do something a little bit different for this next part of our conversation. Because I'm serious in terms of shifting the way we think about sex ed and what's available to us. And so I'm thinking of this portion as like the sex ed syllabus, like thinking of a syllabus. If you were to create a sex ed course for maybe let's say middle and high school kids that's based on just on songs, what songs would you use? And I'm gonna say black folk songs would you use to teach baseline concepts and ideas, or to facilitate conversations with young people from the wide catalog. And you can go as far back as you want, or even something that just came out this year. What do you feel like are some songs that would be part of your syllabus?
I think the first one that came to my mind is "Let's Get It On" by Marvin Gaye, and I think
Come on.
because right, I think we hear it differently than pop culture hears it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's become a song. I think white mainstream media has made it a pun. Like if you watch a
Mm-hmm.
sitcom or a commercial and they're talking about sex in a funny way, they play "Let's Get It On."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They've tried to make it a parody, like
Mm-hmm.
and replace to talk about sex in a very comedic way, which is the antithesis of that song. So it's interesting
That
how
song,
that
yeah.
song was seen as racy, sexual. It's seduction, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then over time, how when white hands get on it, it becomes something that plays in the background as a joke about sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that
Mm-hmm.
like how what was deemed too racy in the 1970s was deemed as something you can play in a commercial during the day. And
Mm-hmm.
who makes those
Mm-hmm.
decisions? And how like one song, like I think that's also like the journey. I think that's it encompasses like how people think about how mainstream media thinks about sex through the black lens, right? So it's like
Mm-hmm.
it was sexy. It's sexy for us, but it's a joke here, right? So I
Yeah.
think that would be one of
Yeah.
the songs, like, and the lesson would be just how people hear what we hear very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. I love that. I love that. So, the song that came up in my mind was actually "Seems Like You're Ready,"
Mm,
R. Kelly, right? And I had a moment when we were talking earlier that I realized that I had self-centered, but I think it's also important to talk about how if you were a young person, especially a young black person in the 90s, there's not a single one of us that didn't have some type of influence listening to that music. Me, Aaliyah, and Brandy were born the same year. So 1979, right? So I was exactly the age that he was targeting with all of that. And so some seems like you're ready. That was a the whole idea of that at the time when you're questioning, should I have sex, should I not have sex, like what do I want my experience and all of that to be, that was such a heavy theme. And actually my experience with young girls now is that they're still asking that question, how do I know if I'm ready, how do I know, and really being able to explore, use that to not allow yourself in a situation where you're being exploited by someone who maybe is too old for you to be dealing with, but thinking through like pleasure, thinking through like your agency of like, what would it mean for me to be ready, what would it mean, like what is it that I would even desire, right? I feel like there's lots of different ways you could go with a song like that, on top of introducing that hit and talking about what does it mean to be in a community and practice accountability around the history of this and around the ways that, quite frankly, we allowed it to happen, right? And so for me, that's definitely a song that I would have on my syllabus of like, let's talk through this and talk about what it meant to have been a young girl who thought she was ready, or who's thinking she's ready, right? And how do you negotiate or not, or peer, regardless of gender, like what does it mean and how do you negotiate that or navigate that in ways that are still life affirming to you without being exploitative? As I was talking, I was like, yeah, definitely I want to take gender off the table of this, because especially when you talk about the adultification of black children, it happens across the board. This assumption that you're older, that you're more, not only that you're ready, but that you have more prowess, you have a certain skill set, you have
hmm
a certain capacity that does not necessarily match what actually is happening in your life. And when you also don't have the space to be able to talk about that, which again I think is the why the importance of sex ed matters, having spaces where you can talk about your insecurities or your strengths and all of that, it amplifies the challenge, it amplifies the trouble that a lot of our young folks end up facing. Okay, so I feel like we could do another round, but
Great.
I'm
So
not gonna have that. I'm like,
right and
go ahead,
wrong way,
Louis.
because when you mentioned the R. Kelly song, I always get that song confused or mixed up with Keith Sweat's Right and Wrong Way because they're similar.
Yes.
Like you may
Uh
be
huh. Yep.
young, but I know that you're ready.
But yeah, yep. That's another one.
Yeah.
That's another, and I feel like that's a whole other discussion about like sexual precocity and how that got snuck under the radar in black music that we don't talk enough about.
And it
And about how.
and
Go
also
ahead.
it being played on Quiet Storm. Like, like if it was,
Yeah.
when I think a lot of stuff, looking back just made it under the radar the way things make it under the radar when we're happy finally something has arrived, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that with the introduction of the Quiet Storm in the 80s, it's like this is a genre, this is a show clearly for Black folk, led and run by Black folk, talking about indirectly, right? Sometimes directly about
Mm-hmm.
sex, and then having artists make music for that format, then those songs
Mm-hmm.
get played on that format without necessarily let's revisit this with these lyrics, right? So I think
Right.
that that's
Let's revisit what this
yeah. So I
means.
think that like
Yeah.
artists like Keith Sweat and R. Kelly were able to slip those things in there because it was couched as a quiet storm, sexy song,
Mm-hmm.
but also in that same vein of, like some days tonight, that there's innocence, that part of what makes sex romantic is if someone in it is innocent and giving up something to the person for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what
Or
makes,
being carried into
yeah,
this careful,
yes, like,
caretaking moment.
that is
Absolutely.
like clean sex
Absolutely.
because it's that's how you know there's trust there because someone is giving up something to someone that they love.
Yeah. Yeah. See? All of that. Y'all want to be in this sex ed course. You want to be there. I know you do. Right. Absolutely. Because we'd be going in having these conversations. Absolutely.
2 years ago, my son was listening to this song, so he's like 16, and I'm cleaning the house, and obviously he listens to music that I don't listen to,
Mm-hmm.
music that my
We got to get his perspective on Throat Baby.
yeah, stuff like that, right? So he listens to stuff,
Right.
and it reminds me of what my brother listened to. Like I listened to Karen White, Mariah and Janet, and he
Mm-hmm.
was like Coogee Rap, Wu Tang Clan, like so, like it was like sonically very different. And the same was with my
Mm-hmm.
son. So I'm cleaning because my mama raised me right, and he is
Right.
playing some hip hop song. I sound like an old person. He's playing some rap
Because we are
song.
old. It's okay. We grown.
And the lyric is, I hear the lyric like she's such a freak that she even played with herself. And I wasn't, you know, I stopped cleaning because in my head I'm like, how is she a freak? Because she plays with herself.
That was my first
So
thought.
I'm like, so I go to my son and I say, can you pause that? And I said, "Can you rewind that real quick?" And he says, "Oh no, no, I can't. I'll play the clean version." I was like, "Oh no, no, I have no problem with that." I'm just like, he said that she's a freak because she plays with herself, and I want to know how is that freaky?
Right.
Because playing with yourself and masturbation, everyone does it. It's normal. So how is it that? What do you hear when he said that? He said, "I just like the
Right.
song." So the conversation didn't really go anywhere because I think that he just was like, I am not talking about sex with my
Got to
father,
get in defense.
right?
Right.
But it reminded me of like as a parent that that there is a way to engage when your young people are listening to this music, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you hear when they say that, or why do you think he says that, or like, I don't think that's freaky. There are a lot of quote unquote freaky things that people can do. That is not one of them, and keep it moving, right? So I think that like
Right.
there is a
Right.
way to incorporate song as a way to begin these conversations, right?
Absolutely.
Even if it's in the car on the way
Absolutely.
to the school, say, hey, can you play that song again? Or just, I think we're fed this notion or this narrative that people oftentimes fall into believe because they're afraid is that we are powerless over the music young people consume.
That's it.
No, and we can be in
Yep.
concert with it. The music helps us, or supports us to have those conversations. Right? Maybe like
Yeah.
I was not going to ever have a conversation with my son and say, "Hey, let's talk about masturbation." Because
Mm-hmm.
he would be that car that Dominique just described. There'd be a backfire, like he would run out. But because of that song, we were able to have somewhat of a conversation of why masturbation is not unquote freaky because
Freaky
a
thing.
woman does it,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And that would have not
Right.
happened had it not been for that song. And I do this kind of work, and I
Yes.
still
Yes.
struggle with how to have these conversations with my son. So I can only imagine
Mm-hmm.
what it's like for people who don't have
That's a good point.
this, right? So that's allowed me to give grace to parents who may be resistant and say like, yeah, as a parent, I sometimes feel that I'm losing control of what my son is consuming. But then I
Mm-hmm.
remember that's not how I roll. That can be an instinct that I
Mm-hmm.
have, and then I have a conversation with myself, say like, he can play whatever he want to play. My mother let me play whatever I want to play. Why are you uncomfortable with what's being played? And
Mm-hmm.
instead of telling him to
Mm-hmm.
turn it off, how can this be a conversation, even if it's just,
Right.
who sings that song? Okay, I mean, just Shazam it real quick as a reminder
Mm-hmm.
for me to bring up the next time we're in the car and I play it to bring it up. So I think there's an
Right.
opportunity to use music as an entryway to connect with your young people.
Yeah, yeah. You actually go right into the next question that I have, Louie. If let's say you have someone who's listening who's like, Louie, I think you've got some gems in what you just said. What's the first step if I want to learn how to talk to my young person about the music that we are both listening to? Because I like Meg Thee Stallion too. Like, how do I start that conversation? How do I, or maybe it's what conversations do I need to have with myself before I do that work?
I would say, what helps me in all conversations is trying to remember that there's no right or wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? My son is not wrong for listening to that song. That song is not wrong, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is an experience. It's a reminder of how people experience sex, how people experience masturbation, right? If I not qualify it as wrong, then the songwriter and the artist is reminding me how we still need to do work around conversations around masturbation and relationships with young black men,
Mm-hmm.
right? And once I
Mm-hmm.
have that reminder, once I don't qualify it as wrong, and oh my God, I got to tweet that artist, and you know what I mean? And once
Mm-hmm.
I don't, say, well, I raised my son better than that. Why is he listening to that song? He should be listening to Mariah because I only want gospel in this house. Once I once I remove that wrong, I'm like, okay, so there's something about him connecting to the song. Is it the
Right.
artist as a whole? Is it the music? Right. So if I'm not in the space of somebody's wrong here and I'm right, so I have to fix it, I'm able to see everything that's at play. And
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
positions me to have a more intentional conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I would say the tip is no right or wrong. There's nothing right and there's nothing wrong. Try to remember that when you're about to have a conversation, because it will prevent you from accusing your young person, your child. It would also stop you, hopefully, from centering yourself in that you somehow did something wrong along the way. It is what it
Mm-hmm.
is. Talk
Mm-hmm.
about what is and have a conversation. That is two way. That what they have to say is important as much as what you have to say. There's nothing to fix and there's nothing wrong, right?
Yeah.
It's just an
Yeah.
opportunity to be closer and to build that relationship that we want to have. And I know that is hard. But
Mm-hmm.
before I go into this conversation, I remind myself there's nothing right or wrong here. I'm not right. I'm not fixing anything. And that helps to ground me or give me somewhat of an agenda or a guidance. Yeah, it gives me a guidance around how to have that conversation. And it does get
Yeah.
easier the more you have it. It's awkward in the beginning because there is a feeling that your power as a parent is being diminished. So there's so much there. Like, am I failing my son? What do people think I'm failing? I do this work, and if I can't have this, so once I'm like, there's nothing wrong here. What people think about me is none of my business, right? And
Facts.
then because it's not fair for me to bring that to my son,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So no right or wrong, there's nothing to fix. There's a bridge to build.
I love that. That's the quotable. Yes, yes. There's nothing to fix, only a bridge to build. Love it. All right, Louie, tell us about Gran Varones.
Um, it is a digital project that focuses on culture, history, and storytelling. So like Louie's mixtape, I think that's they have a connection where we talk about raise history through pop culture, like shows that had queer characters, either that were either they existed in code or who were out. We do a lot of AIDS history. We're now running a series on the songs that soundtracked the AIDS epidemic. We also do community storytelling, collecting stories and experiences of Latino and Black Latinx folks throughout the country. And yeah, it's a great, great project. I work on it with Armante Butler. Shout out to Armante. And we're about
Yes.
to launch our second Gran Varones Positive Digital Arts Fellowship. We got some money to support other creatives, HIV positive creatives throughout the country to do storytelling, because we believe that again, get our stories out there, because 20 years from now, when people are asking how we survived and thrived in this time, they'll be able to hear it from us and not just through academic journals. So yeah,
Yeah.
so it's gran
People who weren't there.
people who weren't there, don't know it, don't want to be there. And it's Gravadones in all social media platforms. So yeah, so check it out.
Yes, yes, yes. I love it. And if there is space, although I feel like more the answer is I'm going to make space. I would love to have you come back and us really get more specifically into the HIV activism, because Gran Varones is such a special project, and as much as possible, I try to, like, if there's any way for me to give voice to it, I'm like, please come share, because it boggles my mind the way that folks are just like, oh, well, we don't know anyone and we can't say, and we just don't, and where are they? And it's like, we're right here,
Yeah.
baby. Like, we're here.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I always close my interviews with my rapid fire questions. So they're basic sentence stems. You answer with whatever comes to your gut. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so the first one is, sexiness is.
Sexiness is music.
Okay, bet. The sexiest thing about blackness and or black people is.
The sexiest thing about Black people and Blackness is authenticity.
Yes, love it, love it, love it. My go-to for feeling sexy is.
Oh my God. My go-to for feeling sexy is a ring light.
Come on, illuminate, yes. I love that. Okay. Sexual freedom for black folk is achieved when.
We don't give a hell what white people got to say.
Period. Awesome. Last one. When I'm done being on this podcast, I will.
Go for a walk with my dog Damon.
Yes. Oh, Damon. Oh my gosh. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm so filled and so thankful. Any last words you want to share with the people before we close it out? Anything at all?
No, I thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. You've totally made my day. The
Yay.
last thing I would say
You
is
made
like,
mine.
like really, 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 really listen to the young people in your life. You'd be surprised how much they know and how much they want to work in partnership with you to support them and guide them.
Ooh. With that, we are done. Thank y'all for listening and take care. Talk to you next time. You've been listening to T.S.O.B. with Dr. G, produced by Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert of Tembe and To keep up with all things T.S.O.B., follow us on social media at T.S.O.B. the podcast, which you can find on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. For past episodes of the show, visit tsobpodcast.com or subscribe to the show either on YouTube or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Now, don't forget that you've got homework for this episode. To find the downloadable worksheet for this or any other episode of the show, head on over again to tsobpodcast.com, where you'll find it and any other important information from the show notes. And finally, do you have any questions or thoughts to share? Sound off by email at mailbox@tsobpodcast.com. Again, this was T.S.O.B, the sex ed of Black folk. Thank you for listening. Talk again soon.